Over to the Big 12, Wes, and looking at the conference tournament odds, you mentioned how ACC is having a down year. I mean, they had a down year last year as well, despite UNC and Duke getting all the way to the Final Four, which was surprising. I don't think that happens this year, but the Big 12 is the best conference in college basketball, bar none. And looking at the latest odds, again, you could head over to TheLines.com to find the best of the number for a lot of these. Kansas, the odds-on favorite, or the favorite, at pretty much every sports book, around plus 275, plus 250, as low as plus 250 at Caesars and FanDuel. Then it's Texas at plus 330, which beat Kansas. Granted, the Jayhawks didn't have a lot to play for in the regular season finale on Saturday. Texas covering as around 2-possession home favorites. Baylor next up. Then it's TCU, which has gotten bet down a bit from the opener at around plus 800. Kansas State next up, around plus 800, as low as plus 650 on DK. Don't necessarily agree with that number. Iowa State tied for those odds, plus 650, as high as 10-1 over at FanDuel Sportsbook. West Virginia was, I believe, open at 32-1, which was a bad number to me at Bet Rivers Sugar House. I have a bet on West Virginia. I'll get to the Mountaineers after you go here, Wes, and then it's Oklahoma State, Texas Tech. We could talk about Red Raiders off the court issues, and I'll briefly mention that when I get to West Virginia, but maybe if you want to hear more about Texas Tech off the court with their former coach at this point, likely going to be former coach in Mark Adams, you could listen to another podcast. But Wes, any thoughts on the Big 12 tournament, any bets or considerations for you fades on a game-by-game basis?
Yeah, theoretically, I guess you could make the case that every single one of these teams could win this tournament, even though Texas Tech, that's kind of, maybe they're just kind of worn out, I think, with everything, the drama with Coach Adams. And you wonder if they're going to check out because they've shown they could be a very good team, but I wouldn't be in on them. And plus they have to win an extra game, obviously, because they're in that 7-10, 8-9 where they play the first day starting on Wednesday. But when I look at this conference, and I will say this from the jump, I think Kansas, they're to me the number one overall seed in the NCAA tournament, regardless of what happens here in the Big 12. They just have too many good wins. And, them and Houston, I think, are the only two actual locks right now for number one overall seeds. I think Alabama certainly could drop. I think UCLA has really put them in good shot. So all my Purdue friends are like, oh, man, they dropped us off the one line. They could get back, if Alabama ends up faltering. But back to the Big 12. When I was looking at this, I agree with the move on TCU. TCU is a team that I think does have a very high ceiling, especially if Mike Miles, is playing healthy. And, he's really the straw that stirs the drink for this team. If you remember.
Yeah, I want to jump in there, and I want to ask you this for your perspective, because I have a bit of an opinion that I'll share when I break down my bet of this conference. Don't you think it's more worthwhile for TCU, not necessarily to show less effort in the Big 12 tournament, but from an injury standpoint, considering all they've had to undergo with the Miles injury and Eddie Lampkin with his knee, their focus is set on the big dance, not the conference tournament. Like, yes, you want to get in some sort of a rhythm, and they're elite defensively when they're onto the half court, like we saw against Texas last week when they won that game. And credit to Longhorns backers because Sir Jabari Rice came through with that last-second three-point shot. But long story short, I just wonder about motivation when, to me, the key factor for TCU is getting healthy, truly healthy for mid-March.
Well, and I kind of think, to your point, maybe Jamie Dixon has bungled this a little bit because I think the guy, Eddie Lampkin, is the guy that's also had some injuries too. And they didn't shut him down for 2 or 3 weeks. He's had to play and he's played 15 minutes, 20 minutes here. And it's maybe shut him down and get him healthy for this time for March, which we're in now. And that's what concerns me. Now, I think that this is a team that can absolutely beat anybody. They're not the best shooting team, so they're very much go to the rim,
to say the least.
Obviously. Yeah, they're not a great shooting team, but defensively they're solid. They've proven that they can play in track meets or they can play in rock fights, because you get a wide variance in the Big 12. I mean, you're going to run a little bit more with the Kansas State or somebody like that, and then you're going to be in those, real like low scoring games like you get Iowa State or somebody of that nature. So TCU I thought was interesting if I'm going a little bit down the board, because I'm not going that far off like a Texas Tech or an Oklahoma or an Oklahoma State. But TCU, I think I'm still seeing them 8-1 or plus 750. They were one that got my attention. And then the other that's a little bit more chalky, and this is not a team that I bet all the time, but the Baylor Bears at relatively close to 5-1, and this is a team that's number one actually in offense, more of an offensive team than a defensive team. Number one in offense and dead last in defense, so it depends on what you value here, but it maybe is more of a situational type thing for me, Eli, because I did not expect them to get housed at home in the season finale by an Iowa State team that looked like they were leaking oil. Caleb Grill gets thrown off the team. I don't know if that's going to eventually be addition by subtraction. It certainly was on Saturday. But, when a team gets like beat at home like that, I kind of tend to think in the finale that it's a little bit of a wake-up call. So I would expect a very focused effort out of Baylor, at least in that first game against Iowa State. And obviously playing a team on a short turnaround after they kicked your butts at home, I think is probably a good thing for Baylor. And then they would get Kansas. They obviously split the season series. Baylor, I think, might be worth something. And I usually won't back a team that's like 10th in a 10-team conference in a few different defensive categories, but I think they could be interesting. They did get George back, after he missed that Oklahoma State game. So Baylor, I think, finally is relatively healthy at the end of the season. They just don't have a ton of games together.
Yeah. I don't trust, not only for the conference tournament, but for the NCAA tournament. And you mentioned their defensive efficiency rating. I just don't trust them enough at that end of the floor. But I get it from a ball screen offensive structure that has arguably been the best that Scott Drew has ever had with these guards. You think about Adam Flagler. Now, he's been in the Big 12. He's been through these wars in the best conference of college basketball over the last few seasons for a while now, but he's a Presbyterian transfer. LJ Cryer. These aren't elite level names, but they're perfect for his system, and they are elite shooters. They may not have the brand name of a big name college basketball player beyond Keontae George, the 5-star freshman that you mentioned who missed some time this year. But again, a three-headed backcourt, kind of similar to one of the teams I mentioned earlier. Very, very prolific shooting team from behind the arc. But my Big 12 betting breakdown is up at TheLines.com. And one quick comparison to TCU before we go to the bet that I made in this conference, Wes. It kind of reminds me of, and maybe this gets thrown back in my face and we see full-fledged effort from the Horned Frogs. They end up going on to win the conference tournament title. We saw it with Baylor back in 2021. Now, granted, they didn't have their legs underneath them because a lot of their guys over the last month plus were dealing with COVID. So we didn't see the effort and we didn't see them truly get healthy until the NCAA tournament when their defense looked elite, because they're the lone exception to, you always hear, okay, what do you need to be a champion? You need a top 20 adjusted offensive efficiency and a top 20 adjusted defensive efficiency. Since KenPom has been in place, they're the lone team that hasn't had that. But that's because of that February disturbing stretch when they were dealing with COVID and that defense wasn't right because their guys weren't right. So I wonder from an effort standpoint if we see a similar kind of vibe to what we saw out of Baylor just looking ahead to the NCAA tournament. But back to my bet here for the Big 12 tournament. I made a bet on West Virginia at 20-1 over at FanDuel Sportsbook. And when I think about luck factor, which is a part of KenPom's metrics, or quote unquote metrics, if you want to consider it that way, Kansas, you mentioned them, and I hit on them at the beginning, being the favorite to win this conference tournament at around plus 250, plus 275. They've been very fortunate, especially in close games. And Kansas, among all their wins this year, 11 of them have come by 2 possessions, so 6 points or fewer, which definitely factors into luck rating. And while this team has very, very good defensive guards, DeJuan Harris, Kevin McCullough, even the freshman Grady Dick, really good on-ball defenders, off-ball defenders too, in terms of generating turnovers, but they don't have that go-to Bill Self low post presence where you run backdoor lobs, kind of like Trace Jackson Davis at Indiana this year.
Right.
You have KJ Adams that can do that, and Uday has come along, one of their freshman 4-star bigs this year, but still not necessarily your McCormick's, your Azabukis, your Perry Ellis's, even though Uday has made some promising, has come along, like I mentioned, down the stretch.
He's starting to get more minutes. I think Self is starting to trust him more, and he kind of has to by necessity.
Yeah, we saw that in the TCU game when Kansas won that. I know a lot of money came in on the Horned Frogs down the stretch in the night before Kansas won that game outright on the road. But so I mentioned West Virginia here, and looking, because they would play Kansas in the quarterfinal, I believe. Kansas obviously getting one of those byes. So winning 4 straight games is definitely a tall task, and I get why you might want to shy away from the Mountaineers. They already have the NCAA tournament bid likely iced up, like we brought up earlier on. But this team is the antithesis of Kansas in terms of being fortunate. They haven't been fortunate this year. They rank, I believe, in the bottom 60 across KenPom in the luck factor rating. So they haven't performed well in close games. And when you think about what factors boil into that for West Virginia, actually, the Mountaineers rank number 310 in KenPom's luck rating, to be specific. But you think about West Virginia having the fourth highest 3-point attempt rate in Big 12 play. So when you're missing 3-point shots like they did in both of those matchups against Kansas, shooting 10 of 41, you're lending yourself towards high variance, and that can either work against you or for you. And they force a lot of turnovers too. And when you're not generating turnovers, and this defense is a little more susceptible than your typical Bob Huggins defense, then you might not fare as well at that end of the floor. So, and also they play at a slower tempo offensively, which when you shrink possessions, this kind of blended into my SIU bet last week. Didn't work out as they got thrown around by Drake on Saturday, but a team that forces turnovers, shoots a lot of threes, and plays at a slower tempo offensively can typically play to more that higher variance ceiling and have a shot with a bigger number. So that's kind of my thought process with West Virginia. Any perspective there for US, or no interest in the current price?
Well, I mean, I think you broke it down. Look, if your price at 20-1, I think it's been cut some other places. They're in like the mid-teens right now, so at least you got some good value there. But this is a team that I think has a lot of variance. Now, they've lost a lot of close games, as you mentioned, and they're not that bad from the foul line. I mean, they're 74% as a team. That's not bad. So, you kind of wonder now. One of the things that they do, I mean, they're not exactly press Virginia like they were a few years ago, but this team will pressure in the backcourt. The one thing I don't like, they commit a lot of fouls that I think are very unnecessary. Where it's like, okay, just play good defense, don't reach. I know you're trying to get turnovers, but you're very good at forcing them, but sometimes, it's very Auburn-esque. Almost in a way. It's like gambling for steals. It's like, don't do that. You've got good defenders. Just play straight up, half-court defense. But look, I'm not going to poo-poo West Virginia. I think they could absolutely win this tournament. I go back, if I'm looking chalky, I'm probably selling Kansas. I don't want to bet Kansas necessarily to win this tournament. And then I don't really know about Texas, I think getting that win, and I had them on Saturday over Kansas on the money line, I think that was kind of like, okay, that was our big win. We wanted to beat those guys. Not that they don't want to win the conference tournament, but I think that was like more of the priority. So I'd be selling Texas a little bit. So that left me kind of by default with Baylor in terms of if you want to go like one of the short prices at more of the top end.